So J.R.D. Tata was a very passionate pilot. In fact, his interest in flying goes back to the days that he would spend in France, and where he had seen at close quarters the French aviator Louis Blériot flying. So J.R.D. Tata became very interested in flying. And when a flying club opened in India, he was the first person to get a pilot's license. So his pilot's license was numbered number 1.
Yeah.
And later, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, an RAF aviator called Neville Vincent, RAF ex-aviator called Neville Vincent, approached him and said, why don't we start a commercial airline in India? India did not have a commercial airline at that time. And J.R.D. Tata believed that commercial aviation was important to the development of the country. And it also was a very good fit with his passion for flying and aviation. It was this set of circumstances. So he actually tried to get support from the government of India, which was then the British government of India. They did not agree to partake in the risk of this venture. J.R.D. Tata had a tough time convincing the Tata Group itself that we should get into aviation. But eventually, he was able to convince the then chairman of the Tata Group, J.R.D. Tata, through a gentleman called John Peterson, who was his mentor as well. And that is how, and even that was on a limited scale. They said you could start the airline with 2 aircraft, 2 small aircraft.
Okay.
And with 2 small puss-moth kind of aircraft is how Tata Airlines started. The first flight of Tata Airlines was in 1932, more specifically 15th of October 1932, from Karachi to Mumbai via Ahmedabad. And J.R.D. Tata piloted that flight himself. He says we soared into the sky, and he calls it one of the finest days of his life. And they eventually landed at Juhu Aerodrome, which was a very small aerodrome in Mumbai in those days, not the kind of airports we have now, mud flats of Juhu. They landed on the mud flats of Juhu, and that was the very first flight of Tata Airlines. That was an airmail flight, but late and very quickly they established very high standards of near 100% punctuality, to the extent that the British government asked the Imperial Airlines to come and study J.R.D. Tata's Tata Airlines and see how do they keep such punctuality. Later, it became a passenger airline, and much later, it was renamed as Air India. And then, of course, it also started international flights. The first international flight was to London, and J.R.D. Tata flew that flight himself to observe how other passengers were liking the flight. And he says, I was so relieved and happy when the flight landed in London after a stopover at Cairo, and saw that all the passengers were delighted. Now, with Tata Airlines and Air India, the one thing that J.R.D. Tata emphasized was the need for world-class levels of service. Air India carried and continues to carry the Indian flag, and therefore it takes India to the world at large, and therefore doubly the need for excellent standards of service in the airline. He would insist on punctuality. And, let me narrate one story.
Sure.
If you have a few minutes
Absolutely.
of time. So, J.R.D. Tata was once flying on Air India. He was the chairman of the airline. And seated next to him was a very senior bureaucrat of the Indian government called L.K. Jha. Now, L.K. Jha looked around and he saw that J.R.D. Tata has gone out of his seat. So he said, okay, maybe he's looking around, maybe he's gone to the bathroom, he'll come back. 10 minutes passed, no J.R.D. Tata. Half an hour passed, no J.R.D. Tata. 1 hour passed and J.R.D. Tata still doesn't come back to his seat. An hour and 10 minutes later, J.R.D. Tata comes back to his seat, and L.K. Jha asks him, Mr. Tata, where did you go? I was getting a little concerned. So J.R.D. says, no, I just went to the aircraft, walked around and came back. Then he understands from the crew that J.R.D. Tata had visited a toilet of the aircraft and found that the toilet paper was not placed right.
Okay.
So he left and he changed the position of the toilet paper and put it into perfect position. And then he went to each of the other toilets of that huge aircraft and did the same thing there. That was his insistence, and that was more signaling to people, to the crew there, that this is how I want excellence to be. And that was the level of excellence that he insisted on. I am told that people in Geneva could keep time on their watches by looking at the time an Air India flight came over their city. Which is why in the 1960s, Air India was voted the best airline by consumers across the world in a survey done by the Sunday Mail of London. Of course, Air India was nationalized by the government, but JRD Tata continued to remain chairman of the airline for several years after its nationalization as well. And personally, I am so proud and happy that the Tata Group has reacquired Air India a couple of years
after 60 years.
A couple of years ago. And our group chairman, Mr. Chandrasekharan, has set out a very clear vision of Air India becoming a world-class airline, which this nation would be very, very proud of in the future. But this story of Air India is a story of pioneering. It's a story of JRD Tata pioneering something new which had never been done in the country before. And to that extent, it's a similar story to what Jamshedji Tata did with Tata Steel. Steel and airlines are very different, very different industries. But what should I say? The foundation of both these stories is the same. Stories of pioneering in areas which are very important to the nation. So that's the story of Tata Airlines and Air India for you.